The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's December. We are back from Thanksgiving break, and it is time to get right into the results from the Ferguson, Missouri grand jury, which decided not to indict Officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of unarmed teenager Michael Brown. The grand jury decided that there would not be an indictment, and that is a very unusual decision for grand juries, and I'll tell you about that. We're going to be talking about this extensively, and we'll go through it piece by piece as I like to do. First of all, the standard for a grand jury indictment, the threshold, is not particularly high. If there is ambiguity about what happened in a particular incident, then there should be an indictment that will get this circumstance, this incident, this event, into the legal system where we can move in the direction of a trial. Now, for those who say, David, Officer Darren Wilson was innocent or he was not guilty. Well, that's something that a jury would decide during a trial. The grand jury is meant to decide what is the evidence from the prosecutors that a crime may have been committed, and does that evidence give us the sense that there is even ambiguity about whether or not a crime was committed. If there is ambiguity, then you would have an indictment and then the legal system would get to work. If indeed Officer Darren Wilson were not guilty, he could still be found not guilty during the trial, or the trial could be dismissed pre-trial before even getting to a point of opening arguments and witnesses and testimony, if it is determined that in fact there is enough exculpatory evidence, for example. Now, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, U.S. attorneys prosecuted 162,000 federal cases in 2010. This is the year for which we most recently have data. Grand juries declined to return an indictment in only 11 of them, 11 out of 162,000 federal cases where there was not even ambiguity about whether a crime had been committed. Andrew Leopold, a University of Illinois law professor, said, quote, "If the prosecutor wants an indictment and doesn't get one, something has gone horribly wrong. It just doesn't happen." Cases involving police shootings, however, have a much higher non-indictment rate. In Dallas, grand juries reviewed 81 police shootings between 2008 and 2012 and returned just one indictment. This starts to flesh out what the problem may be, a sort of skewing of grand juries by the fact that the possible perpetrator, the possible indictee, may be a police officer. Now, this is really crazy. I'm like the last person to go to Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia to explain why why something isn't working or why we should look at something in a different way. But a broken clock is apparently right twice a day. And Antonin Scalia said in 1992, "It is the grand jury's function not to inquire upon what foundation the charge may be denied, but only to examine upon what foundation the charge is made by the prosecutor." This means that no matter what exculpatory evidence might be presented during a trial, if there is enough prosecutorial evidence that there might have been a crime committed, the grand jury should indict and let the legal system run its course. Clearly, this did not happen, and Antonin Scalia, ladies and gentlemen, told us why this decision did not make sense given the documents that we saw after the fact. Let's talk about the prosecution now in the Ferguson, Missouri shooting death of unarmed teenager Michael Brown by police officer Darren Wilson. The St. Louis County prosecuting attorney here was Robert McCulloch. And as I told you, he announced that Darren Wilson would not be indicted for the death of that 18-year-old African-American man. McCulloch said that the grand jury, quote, "gave up their lives while deliberating." And this was just, it seemed like such a boneheaded way to explain what the grand jury had been doing, because it is Michael Brown who lost his life. The grand jury who got to sit there and hear about the evidence that exists for certainly a period of time that I'm sure was an inconvenience to their lives, they did not give up their lives. And this immediately started raising all sorts of questions about this guy, Robert McCulloch. And it seems that we have uncovered a very, very disturbing apparent conflict of interest, a financial conflict of interest involving this prosecutor. I don't know how much of our audience has heard of this. You often want to follow the money, okay? And we did that, and Vox did that. And they found that in addition to his duties as the county prosecutor, Robert McCulloch is also the president of the Backstoppers Incorporated. This is an organization that fundraises for the men and women in uniform in Missouri and in Illinois. And in August, the organization was affiliated with a t-shirt drive that had a picture of Missouri and the statement, "I support D. Wilson." It was set up to raise money for the Darren Wilson Defense Fund as well as the Backstoppers. That's right. The prosecutor in the case, who's in an adversarial situation relative to this police officer, was affiliated with a t-shirt drive that supported the officer who killed Michael Brown. There is a very reasonable argument here that there was a conflict of interest and that a special prosecutor, not Attorney McCulloch, should have been in charge here. And when we start looking at the data about what questions were asked during this grand jury, but more importantly, what questions were not asked, for me, even more red flags are raised. Legal expert Lisa Bloom pointed out on her Twitter account, very astutely pointing out a lot of the just obvious questions here. She said Darren Wilson should have been cross-examined in a different way. For example, he should have been asked, how did Michael Brown solidly, quote, full force, punch you twice in the face, and yet you had no injuries to reflect that? That's a question that should have been asked here. She also went on to say that a key to cross-examination would be requiring Wilson to explain how Michael Brown's allegedly taking one step toward Wilson is, quote, charging him, one of the allegations that was made by Darren Wilson. Wilson testified that he didn't think about whether Michael Brown was armed, but then he focuses on Brown's arm in his waistband, implying that there was a weapon. What about this obvious double standard or contradiction? He didn't think about whether Michael Brown was armed, but he focuses about Michael Brown's arm in his waistband, which clearly indicates he was thinking about whether Michael Brown was armed. Hospital records for Darren Wilson's same-day visit say, quote, he was well-appearing, well-nourished, and in no apparent distress. No one asked him to explain that report. And Wilson's hospital record says there was no bleeding, no laceration, and no bruising. This is a cross-examiner's dream, according to legal analyst Lisa Bloom, and this was not brought up according to the documents that were released during the grand jury. This is very, very strange. And you don't really have to create a conspiracy theory. You can just see that basic cross-examination questions were not asked, and we have found a conflict of interest between the prosecuting attorney and Officer Darren Wilson. These are questions that need to be asked, and instead, most corporate media focused on other sidebar issues to this. Let's now talk about the protests and the reaction to the non-indictment of Officer Darren Wilson in the shooting of unarmed black teenager Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Protests sprang up all over the place. The day before we left for our Thanksgiving break, there were protests in Union Square here in New York City, in Washington Square Park, I believe maybe in Bryant Park. They actually went onto one of the major highways on the east side of Manhattan, the FDR, and these were all over the country, but most of the attention went to the protests happening in Ferguson, Missouri proper. I first questioned the decision to announce the verdict at some time after 8 p.m. in Ferguson, not the verdict, rather the decision on whether to indict or not, so late, because it almost seems like you are deliberately going to stoke these agitated protests when it is dark and when police are going to already be more defensive because of that darkness. and you are almost deliberately leading to an escalation. They announced around 1 or 2 p.m. Eastern that the decision on the indictment would be forthcoming. And then it happened 6 or 7 hours later, once it was already dark. And to me, this is just asking for a situation that is going to not go particularly well. Now, when you looked at the reporting around the so-called looting and the protesting, etc., there was this kind of knee-jerk reaction to link any crime that was committed, any alleged crime, to those who were protesting in defense of Michael Brown. And when you actually look at the evidence, anecdotally, you saw that, yes, there were angry protesters who, in response to the specific decision of the grand jury, were looking to cause mayhem. But the vast majority of those individuals who were involved in the mayhem and involved in the criminality, number one, we have no specific reason to think that they were connected to defending Michael Brown or opposing Darren Wilson, Officer Darren Wilson. And number two, we have more and more information that many of these people came from out of town and they were taking this as an opportunity, the chaos that was going on. They were using that as an opportunity under which to commit crimes. Also remember that there were groups like the KKK that said that they would be out in force. Why is nobody questioning whether anybody involved with the KKK was involved in the mayhem or criminality? I'm not making any specific allegation that they were or defending them and saying that they weren't. But the media narrative is always the protesters are committing crimes. Those who are opposing the police are the ones committing crimes, or those who are minorities are the ones committing crimes. Let's think a little bit more critically about those reports and think about what we're really implying and saying when we see these reports and when we accept them at face value. Last thing I want to talk about with regard to Ferguson and the non-indictment of Officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of unarmed black teenager Michael Brown is gun safety and gun control. And the gun safety issue has been way too far in the background during this entire discussion, even missing altogether. And it is a really big deal. Even if you think that Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson is innocent of any wrongdoing in the shooting death of Michael Brown, any system in which legal police shootings of unarmed civilians are a common occurrence is a system that has serious flaws. And this is an event that happens very often in our society. And very often we focus on, oh, was this officer justified in what they did? Was Michael Brown maybe hiding a weapon or was he not? And we need to take a step back and say, why do we have so many of these shootings? Why are police so afraid of individuals who may have guns? And the reality is that we have this movement from people who want to protect themselves from a potentially tyrannical government by having more and more weapons. And as a result, we see more militarized police. We see SWAT teams being used more and more. We see more of the shoot first, ask questions later attitude from police. And the result is a quantity of police shootings that, regardless of the facts of any particular case, is staggeringly high. Now, there's a racial component, of course. Young black men in particular are paying the price for America's gun culture. But we don't even have to talk about race right now because there's so much with regard to just the gun issue. Japan had no police shootings of people, police killings of people, of civilians, in the most recent year we have data for. Britain had none. Germany had 8. The US had 409 deaths from police shootings. Now, the UK and Germany are not states that have eliminated racism by any means. But the big reason that British police and German police don't shoot civilians is, number one, in the UK, most police don't even carry guns. They actually have a special team. If something comes up that requires police with guns, they have a special team. If police don't have as many guns, they're not going to be shooting and killing as many people. And in the UK, if you have an unarmed teenager who is suspected of shoplifting, the way Michael Brown was, you don't even get the cops with guns showing up. And that, of course, is going to reduce the number of people killed by the guns of police. There is about 1 gun per person in the United States. So, of course, police legitimately need to be able to wield more force than the citizens they're policing. Those who say we're going to get more handguns in case the government becomes tyrannical seem to be blind to the reality that then the government will get shoulder-mounted RPGs and drones and Apache helicopters and tanks, and they are still going to be able to become tyrannical if that truly were their desire, and it leads to more police shootings. So no question about it, we need to have the conversation about gun safety regulations, background checks, etc. back in the picture. And specifically with regard to Ferguson, it's been mostly ignored, and that's a really, really bad thing. Follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/dpacman. Let me know what you think about all this. I know we are going to be continuing the conversation.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to The David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. When reality just doesn't live up to right-wing ideals, there's only one explanation. Reality itself suffers from liberal bias. Find out more at liberalbias.com. Today's new member of the day is Stan Little. Stan, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. You can get a free 2015 Hatriot Mail David Pakman Show calendar with your yearly membership at davidpakman.com/calendar15. This is ending soon because we need to cut it off early enough that we can be sure that before the holiday break, we can get all of the calendars out to everybody. So just a few days left on the free calendars at davidpakman.com/calendar15. You can, of course, support the work we're doing with any Amazon shopping that you do. Go to davidpakman.com, and there's a banner to Amazon on the right side of our website. Click it, then go to Amazon and do all of your gift shopping, your textbooks for next semester, etc. You'll send us a kickback. It doesn't cost you anything, no forms to fill out. I noticed that Moonrise Kingdom was purchased by a viewer of ours through our Amazon link in the recent week. Excellent, excellent movie. Moonrise Kingdom and Grand Budapest Hotel, two of my favorite movies from recent years in that style. If you haven't seen Moonrise Kingdom, I could not recommend it more highly to you. And if you saw Grand Budapest Hotel and liked it, then you will absolutely love Moonrise Kingdom. Also, more and more people buying these all-in-one desktops where it's almost just a screen, a monitor that goes on your desk and the computer is inside of it. I was very hesitant about these when they first came out years ago. And I remember when I worked at Circuit City, which was, I've told stories of what that was like. When I worked there, they were really not very well put together. But now I see more and more people buying these all-in-one desktops. Maybe there is something to that. It certainly saves you some space. So thanks to everybody who has been using our Amazon link. December, the holiday buying season is here. Please think of using our Amazon banner at davidpakman.com when you do any shopping online. Some straight-out racism in Ferguson, Missouri in response to the indictment, the non-indictment of Officer Darren Wilson and the protests that followed after the shooting death of unarmed teenager Michael Brown. Officials added security at an Illinois high school after a student posted a series of racist comments in response to the Ferguson protests saying, and this is just incredible, "I don't feel sorry for black people. If you hate us so much, go BACH to Africa. We should have never bought you," implying buying slaves. Now, why did I say go BACH to Africa? Because that is exactly how this insanely racist tweet was spelled. Go BACH, B-A-C-H, to Africa. The comments were made after the grand jury declined to indict Officer Darren Wilson. The student went on to post, "I mean, this wouldn't happen if black people wouldn't act like hooligans. We don't start a riot when white people die." The comment urging black people to go BACH to Africa was retweeted more than 3,700 times on Twitter. Maybe this is a punctuation issue, right? Maybe what the student meant was go Bach, comma, to Africa, sang to now deceased composer Johann Sebastian Bach that she really didn't like his music, maybe because of the use of major keys in the Brandenburg concertos. Maybe this has all been blown out of proportion, right? And she really meant go Bach to Africa. But I have a feeling it's probably just straight up racism. And the worst part about this is that when you see a high school student post stuff like this to Twitter so unabashedly, this has to be racism that they are learning, I would guess, from their family. I don't want to assume anything and assume that this student didn't learn this racism in school. Maybe they did. But this really seems to be like a virus that just spreads from generation to generation. And it's quite sad. I mean, go Bach to Africa, black people. We shouldn't have bought you. It's just disgusting. We now have video of the police shooting and killing of 12-year-old Tamir Rice. Tamir Rice was playing with a toy gun in Cleveland, Ohio. Police shot and killed him, saying that he refused to put the gun down when they asked him to, and waved it around when they approached, and that because it did not have the orange tip on it that designates it as a toy gun, police assumed that it was a real gun. However, we now have the surveillance video from the park, Cadell Recreation Center on Cleveland's west side. The police have a lot of explaining to do because the video does not corroborate the police story whatsoever. Also now, questions of why police refused to give Tamir Rice first aid. It was not until an FBI agent showed up, who happened to be in the area 4 minutes later, that any attention was given to Tamir. Let's look at the video, pay close attention to it. I'll describe it for people who are just listening. Take a look. Okay, so the police account said something about the shooting, and then we now have video to compare it to, and the two stories don't match. The police officers supposedly were responding to a 911 call, went to the park, saw Tamir take what they thought was a pistol from a table under a gazebo in the park and stuff it in his waistband. Police said that the boy was sitting with a group at the time. Police also said that they told Tamir to raise his hands 3 times and that that's when he reached for what they thought was a real pistol and they shot him. The video shows a completely different situation. Police showed up in a police cruiser. They pull right up to the gazebo where Tamir Rice is sitting. Tamir Rice is by himself. He's sitting there and you can observe him on video completely alone, sitting at a gazebo picnic table, no group of people. The amount of time that it takes for the police officers to draw their guns and start shooting at Tamir simply would not allow for 3 times asking that Tamir put his hands up, for Tamir then to ignore that, supposedly try to go for this gun and start waving it, and then for police to shoot him. This happens in just mere seconds. The car rolls up, police get out and start shooting. So, video. We've talked about police video. We've talked about how important it is to push police departments to wear their cameras, their body-mounted cameras. And the problem, as we've talked about, is that many times when there is an allegation that police have acted improperly, the video that would show us exactly what happened, it was lost, it was deleted. The camera happened to be having technical issues at that time, so we just didn't get that video recorded. We're lucky enough in this case that we have video that was not police video, but just a local security camera that was there. And we see that just about every single element of the police version of the story does not match the video. What would we know about the Michael Brown case if we had more extensive video? Could be from police and it could be from local cameras. What would we have been able to see? Would we have gotten that indictment of Officer Darren Wilson? We seem to have very specific reason here in this case to be really, really outraged, yet we're not seeing the same level of outrage that we saw around Darren Wilson and Michael Brown. I hope more people will become aware of what happened here and will continue to get information from the police about how they explain these obvious discrepancies.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Paul Schulte, who is an honorary professor at Birmingham University, also participated in a recent Birmingham University report into the use of drone warfare. It's really great to have you with us today. You know, we've been talking about drone warfare for several years. It's a topic that you've been studying for some time. To get the audience kind of into the topic, how far back does the use of drones for warfare date?
You can take it quite a long way back. You can certainly take it back to World War II, where the Americans Air Force experimented with remote control bombers, which would just be aimed to fly into large ground things. You could say that the German Navy in World War I, with remote control patrol light motorboats, was also a kind of owned warfare. So there's no clear point. It's obvious that since flying things with remote capacity began to be invented, people began to be interested in using them for warfare.
Do you have a sense that the increase in the discussion around drone warfare in the last 5 to 10 years has been led primarily by technological advancements that have expanded what's possible with drones, or more by pressure upon governments to find alternatives to the way that warfare was being conducted without these recent types of drone development?
Well, I think it's two things. It's the coming together of various technologies. It's lightweight aeronautical materials, better engines, and above all, the kind of remote control technologies, high bandwidth satellites in particular. So that gave this kind of flying weapon more salience than it could ever have had before, because it was just more useful and more effective. But it's also the very controversial American government campaign of counter-terrorist strikes in countries which have not formally agreed to those strikes. Now, whether they're complicit is another matter, but the fact that this is not only morally uncomfortable for a lot of people, but legally questionable for most countries, that made this extremely controversial.
In your report, did you uncover or state or feel that the moral questions are going to be, over the near and middle term, more of an obstacle to increased usage of drones, or do you believe that it is the legal issues that will take precedence?
It's both, because many of the moral concerns about most forms of drone warfare, although the term I don't much like, when people say drone warfare, they tend to focus on the American counter-terrorist campaign rather than the wide range of ways in which drones are being employed and will be employed. So that's having a political effect. the legal side is also difficult, but not for most people. I mean, most countries don't use these weapons, at least at the moment, in a legally questionable way. It's America which is doing that. And then if we look closely at the moral arguments, our report found that many of these are not well founded. They're based on a romantic misunderstanding of what warfare is and what drone warfare is.
There's no question that there are moral misconceptions, but at the same time, I think that we have, you kind of presented the circumstances of the pilot or controller is at personal risk or isn't, as if it were in this kind of black or white scenario. But there is some gray area there, right? Because we do have studies that point out that the psychological impact on someone who is flying a plane that, as you indicate, very well could drop the same bombs that a drone could drop, that is a different experience for the pilot than it is for a drone operator who knows that they're just sitting in a room in some other part of the world. So maybe more gray area is necessary here.
Well, just how different is not clear, because drone pilots too get PTSD, and the research which we looked into seemed to indicate that the rate of PTSD was not very different between manned pilots or people in that equivalent position and remote control operators.
Well, there's no question that there is a difference in terms of empirically, it's a different thing that they are doing. But that's a separate question to the one you're getting to here, which is of rates of PTSD. I just don't think that there's any denying that, practically speaking, we're talking about two different things here.
So I think you seem to be reverting to this use of drone warfare, in inverted commas, to talk about the counter-terrorist campaign, don't you?
I do.
The U.S. is doing.
There's no question that my concerns are very significant when it comes to how the U.S. specifically is using drones. There's no doubt about that. And along those lines, that kind of gets me into what I'm really driving at here, which is that there's what I think is sometimes a misconception among some, certainly here in the U.S. and probably elsewhere, that if we were to say no drones at all for American counterterrorism, that it would mean that instead the U.S. does nothing. And that's practically incorrect, right? What we're talking about here is a situation where drones by the U.S. would be used for counterterrorism instead of other counterterrorism methods that may even lead to more civilian casualties. Do you agree that this is sometimes a red herring in the debate, that those who say no drones for counterterrorism say it thinking that the alternative would be doing nothing?
Yes, I think that's right. But again, let's be clear about terms here. The use that you're referring to, I think, is only, from the way you're talking, is only about the use, say, in Pakistan or Yemen or Somalia. Many of the attacks by drones in Afghanistan would count as counterterrorism. They're going after people who are members of terrorist groups linked with those who are over the border in Pakistan. So again, we must be clear what we're talking about, and we must also be clear that there would be satellites, there would be surveillance drones, which would also be passing information which could prove deadly about people. But you're quite right to say that the alternatives to using kinetic armed drones in cross-border situations without explicit legal consent, that would have alternatives which.
What do you see as the biggest challenge going forward with regard to drones?
The biggest challenge with regard to drones in general, I think, is actually one that we haven't talked about yet, which is the development of armed autonomous or robotic drones that will begin to make their own decisions to save microseconds of combat time, to give them a slight advantage or to avoid being dependent on communications which could be jammed. I think there's the moral problem that we really need to worry about.
And as it stands currently, international law, correct me if I'm wrong, prohibits weapon systems that cannot follow the rules of distinction and proportionality. And is that where this becomes a concern with a robotic drone?
Yeah, they do. They are forbidden by those rules, but you might find countries developing them and saying, "Well, we think our robotic systems are capable of following those. We are convinced, and we're not going to tell you, incidentally, about all the details of our algorithms and hardware that this is good enough and it is legal, and therefore we're going to deploy them." I think that is a risk. There's a UN working party at the elections beginning in Geneva, but this is a problem for the 21st century: how to control artificial intelligence linked to killing.
No question about it. And as artificial intelligence continues to develop and advance, this is no doubt going to be a huge, huge question. To remind our audience, we've been speaking with Paul Schulte, an honorary professor at Birmingham University, participated in Birmingham University's recent report on the use of drone warfare. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really a pleasure having you on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
When we talk about the future of same-sex marriage in the U.S., we often imagine that states like Alabama and Mississippi are going to be sort of the final holdouts against same-sex marriage. But last week, U.S. District Judge Carlton Reeves threw out Mississippi's ban on same-sex marriage, but put that order on hold for 2 weeks so that the state could appeal. Mississippi's Attorney General has already taken those first steps to appeal the ruling which overturned the state ban on same-sex marriage, which is a law that has been on the books since 1997. In 2004, there was a voter-approved constitutional amendment that defines marriage as being between a man and a woman. There's no question that these state bans are not going to stand eventually. I strongly, strongly believe that the Supreme Court, sooner than later, at the rate that this is happening, is going to issue some kind of blanket statement that state constitutional bans on same-sex marriage are not going to fly. And we already have a situation here in Mississippi. Mississippi is one of those states that we really thought would go to the end in preventing same-sex marriage. And we see they have a 1997 law and a 2004 constitutional amendment. So they certainly have been making every effort, but it doesn't seem like it's going to stand. For the time being, there are no same-sex marriages happening in Mississippi. But if by Wednesday, December 10th, there is no decision from the Fifth Circuit Court on this, the same-sex marriages will start. And in 25 years, the people who are opposing this are going to be looked back at the same way that the Catholic Church is for having opposed the Copernican theory, the same way that those who opposed black people in the military are now looked back at, the same way that those who fought against women voting are now looked back at. Go create a job or something. Stop standing in the way of same-sex marriage. It doesn't affect you in any way. Even Navy chaplain, former Navy chaplain, and now Colorado State Representative-elect Gordon Klingenschmidt admitted to me on the program, and there's few people more anti-gay than him, that same-sex marriage actually has had no impact whatsoever on his heterosexual marriage. Let's move on, please. Really weird stuff from Rupert Murdoch, the chairman of Fox News via News Corporation, of course. There's this general thing that happens often where Jesus is portrayed as white, when in reality, if Jesus existed, he was not white, okay? And the latest example of this comes from the religious action-adventure movie Gods and Kings, which follows the trials, tribulations, and plagues of Moses' flight from Egypt with thousands of freed Jewish slaves. And when you look at the trailer, you might notice, wait a second, everybody's white. Moses is white. The Egyptians are white. Everybody's white in this thing. And it turns out that the only people of color in the entire thing are those who are slaves and servants in the film. Now, this is, of course, not at all historically accurate, but it seems that Rupert Murdoch thinks that it is. He went to Twitter to express shock that people are concerned about everybody in the movie basically being white, saying, quote, Moses film attacked on Twitter for all-white cast. Since when are Egyptians not white? All I know are, and then saying, everybody attacks my last tweet. Of course, Egyptians are Middle Eastern, but far from black. They treated blacks as slaves. He continued being mocked. 70-something-year-old Rupert Murdoch is on Twitter talking about how all Egyptians are white, and then people start mocking him. I mean, it's just amazing that he's even engaging with this, as funny as it is. And then he eventually conceded, quote, okay, there are many shades of color, nothing racist about that, so calm down. This is a thing on Fox News, because remember that Megyn Kelly talked about how Jesus was definitely white, even though he was a Middle Eastern Jew. Santa, a fictional character, just is white. You might remember her saying that. This isn't some casual misunderstanding, though, that's not linked to real-world controversies, because there is actually a lot of backstory to the Egyptians are white or aren't they white thing. The question of the race of ancient Egyptians was raised historically as a product of the scientific racism of the 18th and 19th century, and it was actually used to push racial hierarchy based on skin color and facial features. So even though it's just Rupert Murdoch being ignorant and saying, hey, Egyptians just are white, the entire thing around are Egyptians white or not has been used to rank people, to kind of categorize people based on race for hundreds of years, dating back to the 18th century. So as usual, Rupert Murdoch stepping in it, but not even realizing the extent to which what he's saying is incredibly offensive and ignorant. We have our voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. This is a really funny voicemail. Check this out.
Yes, David Backman. I just want to congratulate you on your 30th birthday.
Okay, so first of all, it was Lewis's 30th birthday. My 30th birthday was about a year ago. But let's continue.
I was listening, and you said that you were that old, and I did not know that. I thought you were a lot younger, but I think that the older you get, the one thing you will notice inside that will eat away at your heart, I think, is that the older you get, and you will see this, is you get more conservative in thought and development. So you may be a liberal now, but I guarantee by the time you start getting the gray specks on your hair, your politics and Lewis's politics and Natan's politics, all your politics that you guys on your show will become more conservative and right-wing.
Yeah, this is, first of all, Natan hasn't been on this program for 2 years, but that's just a side note. It's a false assertion that people get more conservative as they get older. What happens is that if you group people by age, the oldest group is always the most conservative, but that's not because people become more conservative as they get older. It's merely that people are raised to be more liberal with each subsequent generation, at least in the last 100 years or so. So that's why you see that trend in aging, but individuals don't get more conservative as they age. I can assure you that I am not going to get more conservative as I age. We have a great bonus show for you today. Join us on the bonus show. Become a David Pakman Show member. davidpakman.com/membership. We couldn't do this show without members, and I hope you will consider signing up for membership today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.